Section 5 of Germinal by Emile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 1, Chapter 5. Maheu, without looking at his watch, which she had left in his jacket, stopped and said, 1 o'clock directly. Zacharie, is it done? The young man had just been at the planking. In the midst of his labor he had been lying on his back, with dreamy eyes, thinking over a game of hockey of the night before. He woke up and replied, "Yes, it will do. We shall see tomorrow." And he came back to take his place at the cutting. Levaque and Chaval had also dropped their picks. They were all resting. They wiped their faces on their naked arms and looked at the roof, in which slaty masses were cracking. They only spoke about their work. "Another chance," murmured Chaval, "of getting into loose earth. They didn't take account of that in the bargain." "Rascals!" growled Levaque. "They only want to bury us in it." Zacharie began to laugh. He cared little for the work and the rest, but it amused him to hear the company abused. In his placid way Maheu explained that the nature of the soil changed every 20 metres. One must be just; they could not foresee everything. Then, when the two others went on talking against the masters, he became restless, and looked around him. "Hush! That's enough." "You're right," said Levaque, also lowering his voice. "It isn't wholesome." A morbid dread of spies haunted them, even at this depth, as if the shareholders' coal, while still in the seam, might have ears. "That won't prevent me," added Chaval loudly, in a defiant manner, "from lodging a brick in the belly of that damned Dansaert, if he talks to me as he did the other day. I won't prevent him, I won't, from buying pretty girls with a white skin." This time Zacharie burst out laughing. The head captain's love for Pierronne was a constant joke in the pit. Even Catherine rested on her shovel at the bottom of the cutting, holding her sides, and in a few words told Étienne the joke, while Maheu became angry, seized by a fear which he could not conceal. "Will you hold your tongue, eh? Wait till you're alone if you want to get into trouble." He was still speaking when the sound of steps was heard in the upper gallery. Almost immediately the engineer of the mine, little Négrel, as the workmen called him among themselves, appeared at the top of the cutting, accompanied by Dansaert, the head captain. "Didn't I say so?" muttered Maheu. "There's always someone there, rising out of the ground." Paul Négrel, M. Hennebeau's nephew, was a young man of 26, refined and handsome, with curly hair and brown moustache. His pointed nose and sparkling eyes gave him the air of an amiable ferret of sceptical intelligence, which changed into an abrupt authoritative manner in his relations with the workmen. He was dressed like them, and like them smeared with coal. To make them respect him he exhibited a daredevil courage, passing through the most difficult spots and always first when landslips or fire damp explosions occurred. "Here we are we not, Dansaert?" he asked. The head captain, a coarse faced Belgian, with a large sensual nose, replied with exaggerated politeness: "Yes, Monsieur Négrel, here is the man who was taken on this morning." Both of them had slid down into the middle of the cutting. They made Étienne come up. The engineer raised his lamp and looked at him without asking any questions. "Good," he said at last. "But I don't like unknown men to be picked up from the road. Don't do it again." He did not listen to the explanations given to him, the necessities of work, the desire to replace women by men for the haulage. He had begun to examine the roof while the pikemen had taken up their picks again. Suddenly he called out: "I say there, Maheu, have you no care for life? By heavens! you will all be buried here." "Oh, it's solid," replied the workman tranquilly. "What, solid? But the rock is giving already, and you are planting props at more than 2 metres, as if you grudged it. Ah! you are all alike. You will let your skull be flattened. Rather than leave the seam to give the necessary time to the timbering, I must ask you to prop that immediately. Double the timbering, do you understand?" And in the face of the unwillingness of the miners who disputed the point, saying that they were good judges of their safety, he became angry. "Go along! When your heads are smashed, is it you who will have to bear the consequences? Not at all. It will be the Company which will have to pay you pensions, you or your wives. I tell you again that we know you. In order to get 2 extra trams by evening, you would sell your skins." Maheu, in spite of the anger which was gradually mastering him, still answered steadily: "If they paid us enough we should prop it better." The engineer shrugged his shoulders without replying. He had descended the cutting, and only said in conclusion, from below: "You have an hour. Set to work, all of you, and I give you notice that the stall is fined 3 francs." A low growl from the pikemen greeted these words. The force of the system alone restrained them, that military system which, from the trammer to the head captain, ground one beneath the other. Chaval and Levaque, however, made a furious gesture, while Maheu restrained them by a glance, and Zacharie shrugged his shoulders chaffingly. But Étienne was, perhaps, most affected. Since he had found himself at the bottom of this hell, a slow rebellion was rising within him. He looked at the resigned Catherine, with her lowered back. Was it possible to kill oneself at this hard toil, in this deadly darkness, and not even to gain the few pence to buy one's daily bread? However, Négrel went off with Dansaert, who was content to approve by a continual movement of his head. And their voices again rose. They had just stopped once more, and were examining the timbering in the gallery, which the pikemen were obliged to look after for a length of 10 metres behind the cutting. "Didn't I tell you that they care nothing?" cried the engineer. "And you, why in the devil's name don't you watch them?" "But I do," stammered the head captain. "One gets tired of repeating things." Négrel called loudly: "Maheu! Maheu!" They all came down. He went on: "Do you see that? Will that hold? It's a 2 halfpenny construction. Here is a beam which the posts don't carry already. It was done so hastily. By Jove! I understand how it is that the mending costs us so much. It'll do, won't it? If it lasts as long as you have the care of it. And then it may go smash, and the Company is obliged to have an army of repairers. Look at it down there. It is mere botching." Chaval wished to speak, but he silenced him. "No, I know what you are going to say. Let them pay you more, eh? Very well. I warn you that you will force the managers to do something. They will pay you the planking separately, and proportionately reduce the price of the trams. We shall see if you will gain that way. Meanwhile, prop that over again, at once. I shall pass to morrow." Amid the dismay caused by this threat he went away. Dansaert, who had been so humble, remained behind a few moments, to say brutally to the men: "You get me into a row, you hear? I'll give you something more than 3 francs fine, I will. Look out!" Then, when he had gone, Maheu broke out in his turn: "By God! What's fair is fair. I like people to be calm, because that's the only way of getting along. But at last they make you mad. Did you hear? The tram lowered, and the planking separately. Another way of paying us less. By God, it is!" He looked for someone upon whom to vent his anger, and saw Catherine and Étienne swinging their arms. "Will you just fetch me some wood? What does it matter to you? I'll put my foot into you somewhere." Étienne went to carry it without rancour for this rough speech, so furious himself against the masters that he thought the miners too good natured. As for the others, Levaque and Chaval had found relief in strong language. All of them, even Zacharie, were timbering furiously. For nearly half an hour one only heard the creaking of wood wedged in by blows of the hammer. They no longer spoke, they snorted, became enraged with the rock, which they would have hustled and driven back by the force of their shoulders if they had been able. "That's enough," said Maheu at last, worn out with anger and fatigue. "An hour and a half, a fine day's work. We shan't get 50 sous. I'm off. This disgusts me." Though there was still half an hour of work left, he dressed himself. The others imitated him. The mere sight of the cutting enraged them. As the putter had gone back to the haulage, they called her, irritated at her zeal. Let the coal take care of itself. And the six, their tools under their arms, set out to walk the 2 kilometres back, returning to the shaft by the road of the morning. At the chimney, Catherine and Étienne were delayed while the pikemen slid down. They met little Lydie, who stopped in a gallery to let them pass, and told them of the disappearance of Mouquette, whose nose had been bleeding so much that she had been away an hour, bathing her face somewhere, no one knew where. Then, when they left her, the child began again to push her tram, weary and muddy, stiffening her insect like arms and legs like a lean black ant struggling with a load that was too heavy for it. They let themselves down on their backs, flattening their shoulders for fear of scratching the skin on their foreheads, and they walked so close to the polished rock at the back of the stalls that they were obliged from time to time to hold on to the woodwork, so that their backsides should not catch fire, as they said jokingly. Below they found themselves alone. Red stars appeared afar at a bend in the passage. Their cheerfulness fell. They began to walk with the heavy step of fatigue, she in front, he behind. Their lamps were blackened. He could scarcely see her, drowned in a sort of smoky mist, and the idea that she was a girl disturbed him because he felt that it was stupid not to embrace her, and yet the recollection of the other man prevented him. Certainly she had lied to him. The other was her lover. They lay together on all those heaps of slaty coal, for she had a loose woman's gait. He sulked without reason, as if she had deceived him. She, however, every moment turned round, warned him of obstacles, and seemed to invite him to be affectionate. They were so lost here; it would have been so easy to laugh together like good friends. At last they entered the large haulage gallery. It was a relief to the indecision from which he was suffering, while she once more had a saddened look, the regret for a happiness which they would not find again. Now the subterranean life rumbled around them with the continual passing of captains, the come and go of the trams drawn by trotting horses. Lamps starred the night everywhere. They had to efface themselves against the rock to leave the path free to shadowy men and beasts, whose breath came against their faces. Jeanlin, running barefooted behind his tram, cried out some naughtiness to them which they could not hear amid the thunder of the wheels. They still went on, she now silent, he not recognizing the turnings and roads of the morning, and fancying that she was leading him deeper and deeper into the earth. And what specially troubled him was the cold, an increasing cold which he had felt on emerging from the cutting, and which caused him to shiver the more the nearer they approached the shaft. Between the narrow walls the column of air now blew like a tempest. They despaired of ever coming to the end, when suddenly they found themselves in the pit eye hall. Chaval cast a sidelong glance at them, his mouth drawn with suspicion. The others were there, covered with sweat in the icy current, silent like himself, swallowing their grunts of rage. They had arrived too soon, and could not be taken to the top for half an hour, more especially since some complicated manoeuvres were going on for lowering a horse. The porters were still rolling the trams with the deafening sound of old iron in movement, and the cages were flying up, disappearing in the rain which fell from the black hole. Below, the sump, a cesspool 10 metres deep, filled with this streaming water, also exhaled its muddy moisture. Men were constantly moving around the shaft, pulling the signal cords, pressing on the arms of levers, in the midst of this spray in which their garments were soaked. The reddish light of 3 open lamps cut out great moving shadows and gave to this subterranean hall the air of a villainous cavern, some bandit's forge. near a torrent. Maheu made one last effort. He approached Pierron, who had gone on duty at 6 o'clock. "Here, you might as well let us go up." But the porter, a handsome fellow with strong limbs and a gentle face, refused with a frightened gesture. "Impossible. Ask the captain. They would find me." Fresh growls were stifled. Catherine bent forward and said in Étienne's ear: "Come and see the stable, then. That's a comfortable place." And they had to escape without being seen, for it was forbidden to go there. It was on the left, at the end of a short gallery, 25 metres in length and nearly 4 high, cut in the rock and vaulted with bricks. It could contain 20 horses. It was, in fact, comfortable there. There was a pleasant warmth of living beasts, the good odour of fresh and well kept litter. The only lamp threw out the calm rays of a night light. There were horses there, at rest, who turned their heads with their large, infantine eyes, then went back to their hay, without haste, like fat, well kept workers, loved by everybody. But as Catherine was reading aloud their names, written on zinc plates over the mangers, she uttered a slight cry, seeing something suddenly rise before her. It was Mouquette, who emerged in fright from a pile of straw in which she was sleeping. On Monday, when she was overtired with her Sunday spree, she gave herself a violent blow on the nose, and left her cutting under the pretence of seeking water, to bury herself here with the horses in the warm litter. Her father, being weak with her, allowed it, and at the risk of getting into trouble. Just then Mouque, the father, entered, a short, bald, worn out looking man, but still stout, which is rare in an old miner of 50. Since he had been made a groom he chewed to such a degree that his gums bled in his black mouth. On seeing the two with his daughter he became angry. "What are you up to there, all of you? Come, up! The jades! Bringing a man here! It's a fine thing to come and do your dirty tricks in my straw." Mouquette thought it funny, and held her sides. But Étienne, feeling awkward, moved away, while Catherine smiled at him. As all three returned to the pit eye, Bébert and Jeanlin arrived there also with a train of tubs. There was a stoppage for the manoeuvring of the cages, and the young girl approached their horse, caressed it with her hand, and talked about it to her companion. It was Bataille, the doyen of the mine, a white horse who had lived below for 10 years. These 10 years he had lived in this hole, occupying the same corner of the stable, doing the same task along the black galleries without ever seeing daylight. Very fat, with shining coat and a good natured air, he seemed to lead the existence of a sage, sheltered from the evils of the world above. In this darkness, too, he had become very cunning. The passage in which he worked had grown so familiar to him that he could open the ventilation doors with his head, and he lowered himself to avoid knocks at the narrowest spots. Without doubt, also, he counted his turns, for when he had made the regulation number of journeys he refused to do any more, and had to be led back to his manger. Now that old age was coming on, his cat's eyes were sometimes dimmed with melancholy. Perhaps he vaguely saw again, in the depths of his obscure dreams, the mill at which he was born, near Marchiennes, a mill placed on the edge of the Scarpe, surrounded by large fields over which the wind always blew. Something burnt in the air, an enormous lamp, the exact appearance of which escaped his beast's memory, and he stood with lowered head, trembling on his old feet, making useless efforts to recall the sun. Meanwhile the manoeuvres went on in the shaft. The signal hammer had struck 4 blows, and the horse was being lowered. There was always excitement at such a time, for it sometimes happened that the beast was seized by such terror that it was landed dead. When put into a net at the top it struggled fiercely; then, when it felt the ground no longer beneath it, it remained as if petrified and disappeared without a quiver of the skin, with enlarged and fixed eyes. This animal being too big to pass between the guides, it had been necessary, when hooking it beneath the cage, to pull down the head and attach it to the flanks. The descent lasted nearly 3 minutes, the engine being slowed as a precaution. Below, the excitement was increasing. What then? Was he going to be left on the road, hanging in the blackness? At last he appeared in his stony immobility, his eye fixed and dilated with terror. It was a bay horse hardly 3 years of age, called Trompette. "Attention!" cried Father Mouque, whose duty it was to receive it. "Bring him here. Don't undo him yet." Trompette was soon placed on the metal floor in a mass. Still he did not move. He seemed in a nightmare in this obscure infinite hole, this deep hall echoing with tumult. They were beginning to unfasten him, when Bataille, who had just been unharnessed, approached and stretched out his neck to smell this companion who lay on the earth. The workmen jokingly enlarged the circle. Well, what pleasant odour did he find in him? But Bataille, deaf to mockery, became animated. He probably found in him the good odour of the open air, the forgotten odour of the sun on the grass, and he suddenly broke out into a sonorous neigh, full of musical gladness, in which there seemed to be the emotion of a sob. It was a greeting, the joy of those ancient things of which a gust had reached him, the melancholy of one more prisoner who would not ascend again until death. "Ah! that animal Bataille!" shouted the workmen, amused at the antics of their favourite. "He's talking with his mate." Trompette was unbound, but still did not move. He remained on his flank, as if he still felt the net restraining him, garrotted by fear. At last they got him up with a lash of the whip, dazed and his limbs quivering. And Father Mouque led away the two beasts, fraternizing together. "Here, is it ready yet?" asked Maheu. It was necessary to clear the cages, and besides it was yet 10 minutes before the hour for ascending. Little by little the stalls emptied, and the miners returned from all the galleries. There were already some 50 men there, damp and shivering, their inflamed chests panting on every side. Pierron, in spite of his mawkish face, struck his daughter Lydie, because she had left the cutting before time. Zacharie slyly pinched Mouquette, with a joke about warming himself. But the discontent increased. Chaval and Levaque narrated the engineer's threat, the tram to be lowered in price, and the planking paid separately. And exclamations greeted the scheme. A rebellion was germinating in this little corner, nearly 600 metres beneath the earth. Soon they could not restrain their voices. These men, soiled by coal, and frozen by the delay, accused the Company of killing half their workers at the bottom, and starving the other half to death. Étienne listened, trembling. "Quick! quick!" repeated the captain, Richomme, to the porters. He hastened the preparations for the ascent, not wishing to be hard, pretending not to hear. However, the murmurs became so loud that he was obliged to notice them. They were calling out behind him that this would not last always, and that one fine day the whole affair would be smashed up. "You're sensible," he said to Maheu. "Make them hold their tongues. When one hasn't got power one must have sense." But Maheu, who was getting calm, and had at last become anxious, did not interfere. Suddenly the voices fell. Négrel and Dansaert, returning from their inspection, entered from a gallery, both of them sweating. The habit of discipline made the men stand in rows, while the engineer passed through the group without a word. He got into one tram, and the head captain into another. The signal was sounded 5 times, ringing for the butcher's meat, as they said for the masters, and the cage flew up in the air in the midst of a gloomy silence. Section 6 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Part 1, Chapter 6. As he ascended in the cage, heaped up with 4 others, Étienne resolved to continue his famished course along the roads. One might as well die at once as go down to the bottom of that hell, where it was not even possible to earn one's bread. Catherine, in the tram above him, was no longer at his side with her pleasant, enervating warmth, and he preferred to avoid foolish thoughts and to go away, for with his wider education he felt nothing of the resignation of this flock. He would end by strangling one of Masters. Suddenly he was blinded. The ascent had been so rapid that he was stunned by the daylight, and his eyelids quivered in the brightness to which he had already grown unaccustomed. It was none the less a relief to him to feel the cage settle on to the bars. A lander opened the door, and a flood of workmen leapt out of the trams. "I say, Mouquette," whispered Zacharie in the lander's ear, "are we off to the Volcan to night?" The Volcan was a café concert at Montsou. Mouquette winked his left eye with a silent laugh which made his jaws gape. Short and stout like his father, he had the impudent face of a fellow who devours everything, without care for the morrow. Just then Mouquette came out in her turn, and he gave her a formidable smack on the flank by way of fraternal tenderness. Étienne hardly recognized the lofty nave of the receiving hall, which had before looked imposing in the ambiguous light of the lanterns. It was simply bare and dirty. A dull light entered through the dusty windows. The engine alone shone at the end with its copper. The well greased steel cables moved like ribbons soaked in ink, and the pulleys above, the enormous scaffold which supported them, the cages, the trams, all this prodigality of metal, made the hall look sombre with their hard grey tones of old iron. Without ceasing, the rumbling of the wheels shook the metal floor, while from the coal thus put in motion there arose a fine charcoal powder which powdered black the soil, the walls, even the joists of the steeple. But Chaval, after glancing at the table of counters in the receiver's little glass office, came back furious. He had discovered that two of their trams had been rejected, one because it did not contain the regulation amount, the other because the coal was not clean. "This finishes the day!" he cried. "20 sous less again! This is because we take on lazy rascals who use their arms as a pig does his tail!" And a sidelong look at Étienne completed his thought. The latter was tempted to reply by a blow. Then he asked himself what would be the use, since he was going away. This decided him absolutely. "It's not possible to do it right the first day," said Maheu, to restore peace. "He'll do better to morrow." They were all none the less soured, and disturbed by the need to quarrel. As they passed to the lamp cabin to give up their lamps, Levaque began to abuse the lampman, whom he accused of not properly cleaning his lamp. They only slackened down a little in the shed, where the fire was still burning. It had even been too heavily piled up, for the stove was red and the vast room, without a window, seemed to be in flames, to such a degree did the reflection make bloody the walls. And there were grunts of joy; all the backs were roasted at a distance till they smoked like soup. When their flanks were burning, they cooked their bellies. Mouquette had tranquilly let down her breeches to dry her chemise. Some lads were making fun of her. They burst out laughing because she suddenly showed them her posterior, a gesture which in her was the extreme expression of contempt. "I'm off," said Chaval, who had shut up his tools in his box. No one moved. Only Mouquette hastened, and went out behind him on the pretext that they were both going back to Montsou. But the others went on joking; they knew that he would have no more to do with her. Catherine, however, who seemed preoccupied, was speaking in a low voice to her father. The latter was surprised; then he agreed with a nod, and calling Étienne to give him back his bundle. "Listen," he said, "you haven't a sou. You will have time to starve before the fortnight's out. Shall I try and get you credit somewhere?" The young man stood for a moment confused. He had been just about to claim his 30 sous and go. But shame restrained him before the young girl. She looked at him fixedly; perhaps she would think he was shirking the work. "You know I can promise you nothing." Maheu went on. "They can but refuse us." Then Étienne consented. They would refuse. Besides, it would bind him to nothing. He could still go away after having eaten something. Then he was dissatisfied at not having refused, seeing Catherine's joy, a pretty laugh, a look of friendship, happy at having been useful to him. What was the good of it all? When they had put on their sabots and shut their boxes, the Maheus left the shed, following their comrades, who were leaving one by one after they had warmed themselves. Étienne went behind. Levaque and his urchin joined the band. But as they crossed the screening place, a scene of violence stopped them. It was in a vast shed, with beams blackened by the powder and large shutters, through which blew a constant current of air. The coal trams arrived straight from the receiving room and were then overturned by the tipping cradles on to hoppers, long iron slides; and to right and to left of these the screeners, mounted on steps and armed with shovels and rakes, separated the stone and swept together the clean coal, which afterwards fell through funnels into the railway wagons beneath the shed. Philoméne Levaque was there, thin and pale, with the sheep like face of a girl who spat blood. With head protected by a fragment of blue wool and hands and arms black to the elbows, she was screening beneath an old witch, the mother of Pierron, the Brulé, as she was called, with terrible owl's eyes, and a mouth drawn in like a miser's purse. They were abusing each other, the young one accusing the elder of raking her stones so that she could not get a basketful in 10 minutes. They were paid by the basket, and these quarrels were constantly arising. Hair was flying, and hands were making black marks on red faces. "Give it her bloody well!" cried Zacharie, from above, to his mistress. All the screeners laughed, but the Brulé turned snappishly on the young man. "Now then, dirty beast, you'd better to own the 2 kids you have filled her with. Fancy that, a slip of 18, who can't stand straight!" Maheu had to prevent his son from descending to see, as he said, the colour of this carcass's skin. A foreman came up and the rakes again began to move the coal. One could only see, all along the hoppers, the round backs of women squabbling incessantly over the stones. Outside, the wind had suddenly quieted, a moist cold was falling from a grey sky. The colliers thrust out their shoulders, folded their arms, and set forth irregularly, with a rolling gait which made their large bones stand out beneath their thin garments. In the daylight they looked like a band of negroes thrown into the mud. Some of them had not finished their bricks, and the remains of the bread carried between the shirt and the jacket made them humpbacked. "Hullo! there's Bouteloup," said Zacharie, grinning. Levaque, without stopping, exchanged 2 sentences with his lodger, a big dark fellow of 35 with a placid, honest air. "Is the soup ready, Louis?" "I believe it is." "Then the wife is good humoured to day?" "Yes, I believe she is." Other miners, bound for the earth cutting, came up, new bands which one by one were engulfed in the pit. It was the 3 o'clock descent, more men for the pit to devour, the gangs who would replace the sets of the pikemen at the bottom of the passages. The mine never rested. Day and night human insects were digging out the rock 600 metres below the beetroot fields. However, the youngsters went ahead. Jeanlin confided to Bébert a complicated plan for getting 4 sous worth of tobacco on credit, while Lydie followed respectfully at a distance. Catherine came with Zacharie and Étienne. None of them spoke, and it was only in front of the Avantage inn that Maheu and Levaque rejoined them. "Here we are," said the former to Étienne. "Will you come in?" They separated. Catherine had stood a moment motionless, gazing once more at the young man with her large eyes full of greenish limpidity, like spring water. The crystal deepened the more by her black face. She smiled and disappeared with the others on the road that led up to the settlement. The inn was situated between the village and the mine, at the crossing of 2 roads. It was a 2-storied brick house, whitewashed from top to bottom, enlivened around the windows by a broad pale blue border. On a square sign board nailed above the door one read in yellow letters: L'Avantage, licensed to Rasseneur. Behind it stretched a skittle ground enclosed by a hedge. The Company, who had done everything to buy up the property placed within its vast territory, was in despair over this inn in the open fields, at the very entrance of the Voreux. "Go in," said Maheu to Étienne. The little parlour was quite bare with its white walls, its three tables and its dozen chairs, its deal counter about the size of a kitchen dresser. There were a dozen glasses at most, three bottles of liqueur, a decanter, a small zinc tank with a pewter tap to hold the beer, and nothing else. Not a figure, not a little table, not a game. In the metal fireplace, which was bright and polished, a coal fire was burning quietly. On the flags a thin layer of white sand drank up the constant moisture of this water soaked land. "A glass," ordered Maheu of a big fair girl, a neighbour's daughter who sometimes took charge of the place. "Is Rasseneur in?" The girl turned the tap, replying that the master would soon return. In a long, slow gulp the miner emptied half his glass to sweep away the dust which filled his throat. He offered nothing to his companion. One other customer, a damp and besmeared miner, was seated before the table, drinking his beer in silence, with an air of deep meditation. A third entered, was served in response to a gesture, paid and went away without uttering a word. But a stout man of 38, with a round shaven face and a good natured smile, now appeared. It was Rasseneur, a former pikeman whom the Company had dismissed 3 years ago after a strike. A very good workman, he could speak well, put himself at the head of every opposition, and had at last become the chief of the discontented. His wife already held a licence, like many miners' wives, and when he was thrown on to the street he became an innkeeper himself. Having found the money, he placed his inn in front of the Voreux as a provocation to the Company. Now his house had prospered, it had become a centre, and he was enriched by the animosity he had gradually fostered in the hearts of his old comrades. "This is a lad I hired this morning," said Maheu at once. "Have you got one of your 2 rooms free, and will you give him credit for a fortnight?" Rasseneur's broad face suddenly expressed great suspicion. He examined Étienne with a glance, and replied, without giving himself the trouble to express any regret: "My 2 rooms are taken. Can't do it." The young man expected this refusal, but it hurt him nevertheless, and he was surprised at the sudden grief he experienced in going. No matter, he would go when he had received his 30 sous. The miner who was drinking at a table had left. Others, one by one, continued to come in to clear their throats, then went on their road with the same slouching gait. It was a simple swilling without joy or passion, the silent satisfaction of a need. "Then there's no news?" Rasseneur asked in a peculiar tone of Maheu, who was finishing his beer in small gulps. The latter turned his head, and saw that only Étienne was near. "There's been more squabbling. Yes, about the timbering." He told the story. The innkeeper's face reddened, swelling with emotion, which flamed in his skin and eyes. At last he broke out: "Well, well! If they decide to lower the price, they are done for." Étienne constrained him, however; he went on, throwing sidelong glances in his direction. And there were reticences and implications. He was talking of the manager, M. Hennebeau, of his wife, of his nephew, the little Négrel, without naming them, repeating that this could not go on, that things were bound to smash up one of these fine days. The misery was too great. And he spoke of the workshops that were closing, the workers who were going away. During the last month he had given more than 6 pounds of bread a day. He had heard the day before that M. Deneulin, the owner of a neighbouring pit, could scarcely keep going. He had also received a letter from Lille, full of disturbing details. "You know," he whispered, "it comes from that person you saw here one evening." But he was interrupted. His wife entered in her turn, a tall woman, lean and keen, with a long nose and violet cheeks. She was a much more radical politician than her husband. "Pluchart's letter," she said. "Ah! if that fellow was master things would soon go better." Étienne had been listening for a moment. He understood and became excited over these ideas of misery and revenge. This name, suddenly uttered, caused him to start. He said aloud, as if in spite of himself: "I know him, Pluchart." They looked at him. He had to add: "Yes, I am an engine man. He was my foreman at Lille. A capable man. I have often talked with him." Rasseneur examined him afresh, and there was a rapid change on his face, a sudden sympathy. At last he said to his wife: "It's Maheu who brings me this gentleman, one of his putters, to see if there is a room for him upstairs, and if we can give him credit for a fortnight." Then the matter was settled in 4 words. There was a room. The lodger had left that morning. And the innkeeper, who was very excited, talked more freely, repeating that he only asked possibilities from the masters, without demanding, like so many others, things that were too hard to get. His wife shrugged her shoulders and demanded justice, absolutely. "Good evening," interrupted Maheu. "All that won't prevent men from going down. And as long as they go there will be people working themselves to death. Look how fresh you are, these 3 years that you've been out of it." "Yes, I'm very much better," declared Rasseneur complacently. Étienne went as far as the door, thanking the miner, who was leaving. But the latter nodded his head without adding a word, and the young man watched him painfully climb up the road to the settlement. Madame Rasseneur, occupied with serving customers, asked him to wait a minute, when she would show him his room, where he could clean himself. Should he remain? He again felt hesitation, a discomfort which made him regret the freedom of the open road, the hunger beneath the sun, endured with the joy of being one's own master. It seemed to him that he had lived years from his arrival on the pit bank, in the midst of squalls, to those hours passed under the earth on his belly in the black passages. And he shrank from beginning again. It was unjust and too hard. His man's pride revolted at the idea of becoming a crushed and blinded beast. While Étienne was thus debating with himself, his eyes, wandering over the immense plain, gradually began to see it clearly. He was surprised. He had not imagined the horizon was like this, when old Bonnemort had pointed it out to him in the darkness. Before him he plainly saw the Voreux in a fold of the earth, with its wood and brick buildings, the tarred screening shed, the slate covered steeple, the engine room, and the tall, pale, red chimney, all massed together with that evil air. But around these buildings the space extended, and he had not imagined it so large, changed into an inky sea by the ascending waves of coal soot, bristling with high trestles which carried the rails of the foot bridges, encumbered in one corner with the timber supply, which looked like the harvest of a mown forest. Towards the right the pit bank hid the view, colossal as a barricade of giants, already covered with grass in its older part, consumed at the other end by an interior fire which had been burning for a year with a thick smoke, leaving at the surface, in the midst of the pale grey of the slates and sandstones, long trails of bleeding rust. Then the fields unrolled, the endless fields of wheat and beetroot, naked at this season of the year, marshes with scanty vegetation, cut by a few stunted willows, distant meadows separated by slender rows of poplars. Very far away, little pale patches indicated towns, Marchiennes to the north, Montsou to the south, while the forest of Vandame to the east bordered the horizon with the violet line of its leafless trees. And beneath the livid sky, in the faint daylight of this winter afternoon, it seemed as if all the blackness of the Voreux and all its flying coal dust had fallen upon the plain, powdering the trees, sanding the roads, sowing the earth. Étienne looked, and what especially surprised him was a canal, the canalized stream of the Scarpe, which he had not seen in the night. From the Voreux to Marchiennes this canal ran straight, like a dull silver ribbon 2 leagues long, an avenue lined by large trees, raised above the low earth, threading into space with the perspective of its green banks, its pale water into which glided the vermilion of the boats. Near one pit there was a wharf with moored vessels which were laden directly from the trams at the foot bridges. Afterwards the canal made a curve, sloping by the marshes, and the whole soul of that smooth plain appeared to lie in this geometrical stream, which traversed it like a great road carting coal and iron. Étienne's glance went up from the canal to the settlement built on the height, of which he could only distinguish the red tiles. Then his eyes rested again at the bottom of the clay slope, toward the Voreux, on two enormous masses of bricks made and burnt on the spot. A branch of the company's railroad passed behind a paling, for the use of the pit. They must be sending down the last miners to the earth cutting. Only one shrill note came from a truck pushed by men. One felt no longer the unknown darkness, the inexplicable thunder, the flaming of mysterious stars. Afar, the blast furnaces and the coke kilns had paled with the dawn. There only remained, unceasingly, the escapement of the pump, always breathing with the same thick, long breath, the ogre's breath of which he could now see the grey steam, and which nothing could satiate. Then Étienne suddenly made up his mind. Perhaps it seemed to see again Catherine's clear eyes, up there, at the entrance to the settlement. Perhaps, rather, it was the wind of revolt which came from the Voreux. He did not know, but he wished to go down again to the mine, to suffer and to fight. And he thought fiercely of those people Bonnemort had talked of, the crouching and sated god, to whom 10,000 starving men gave their flesh without knowing it. End of Section 6. Section 7 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translation by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Berard. Part 2, Chapter 1. The Grégoires' property, Piolaine, was situated 2 kilometres to the east of Montsou, on the Oiselle road. The house was a large square building, without style, dating from the beginning of the last century. Of all the land that once belonged to it, there only remained some 30 hectares, enclosed by walls, and easy to keep up. The orchard and kitchen garden especially were everywhere spoken of, being famous for the finest fruit and vegetables in the country. For the rest, there was no park, only a small wood. The avenue of old limes, a vault of foliage 300 metres long, reaching from the gate to the porch, was one of the curiosities of this bare plain, on which one could count the large trees between Marchiennes and Beaugnies. On that morning the Grégoires got up at 8 o'clock. Usually they never stirred until an hour later, being heavy sleepers, but last night's tempest had disturbed them. And while her husband had gone at once to see if the wind had made any havoc, Madame Grégoire went down into the kitchen in her slippers and flannel dressing gown. She was short and stout, about 58 years of age, and retained a broad, surprised, dollish face beneath the dazzling whiteness of her hair. "Mélanie," she said to the cook, "suppose you were to make the brioche this morning, since the dough is ready. Mademoiselle will not get up for half an hour yet, and she can eat it with her chocolate, eh? It will be a surprise." The cook, a lean old woman who had served them for 30 years, laughed. "That is true, it will be a famous surprise. My stove is alight, and the oven must be hot, and then Honorine can help me a bit." Honorine, a girl of some 20 years, who had been taken in as a child and brought up in the house, now acted as housemaid. Besides these 2 women, the only other servant was the coachman, Francis, who undertook the heavy work. A gardener and his wife were occupied with the vegetables, the fruit, the flowers, and the poultry yard. And as service here was patriarchal, this little world lived together, like one large family, on very good terms. Madame Grégoire, who had planned this surprise of the brioche in bed, waited to see the dough put in the oven. The kitchen was very large, and one guessed it was the most important room in the house by its extreme cleanliness and by the arsenal of saucepans, utensils, and pots which filled it. It gave an impression of good feeding. Provisions abounded, hanging from hooks or in cupboards. "And let it be well glazed, won't you?" Madame Grégoire said as she passed into the dining room. In spite of the hot air stove which warmed the whole house, a coal fire enlivened this room. In other respects it exhibited no luxury. A large table, chairs, a mahogany sideboard, only two deep easy chairs, betrayed a love of comfort, long happy hours of digestion. They never went into the drawing room, they remained here in a family circle. Just then Monsieur Grégoire came back dressed in a thick fustian jacket. He also was ruddy for his 60 years, with large, good-natured, honest features beneath the snow of his curly hair. He had seen the coachman and the gardener. There had been no damage of importance, nothing but a fallen chimney-pot. Every morning he liked to give a glance round Piolaine, which was not large enough to cause him anxiety, and from which he derived all the happiness of ownership. "And Cécile?" he asked. "Isn't she up yet then?" "I can't make it out," replied his wife. "I thought I heard her moving." The table was set. There were 3 cups on the white cloth. They sent Honorine to see what had become of Mademoiselle, but she came back immediately, restraining her laughter, stifling her voice, as if she were still upstairs in the bedroom. "Oh, if monsieur and madame could see mademoiselle! She sleeps, oh, she sleeps like an angel. I can't imagine it. It's a pleasure to look at her." The father and mother exchanged tender looks. He said, smiling: "Will you come and see?" "The poor little darling," she murmured. "I'll come." And they went up together. The room was the only luxurious one in the house. It was draped in blue silk, and the furniture was lacquered white, with blue tracery, a spoilt child's whim, which her parents had gratified. In the vague whiteness of the bed, beneath the half light which came through a curtain that was drawn back, the young girl was sleeping with her cheek resting on her naked arm. She was not pretty, too healthy, in too vigorous condition, fully developed at 18, but she had superb flesh, the freshness of milk, with her chestnut hair, her round face, and little wilful nose lost between her cheeks. The coverlet had slipped down, and she was breathing so softly that her respiration did not even lift her already well developed bosom. "That horrible wind must have prevented her from closing her eyes," said the mother softly. The father imposed silence with a gesture. Both of them leant down and gazed with adoration on this girl, in her virgin nakedness, whom they had desired so long, and who had come so late, when they had no longer hoped for her. They found her perfect, not at all too fat, and could never feed her sufficiently. And she went on sleeping, without feeling them near her, with their faces against hers. However, a slight movement disturbed her motionless face. They feared that they would wake her, and went out on tiptoe. "Hush!" said Monsieur Grégoire at the door. "If she has not slept, we must leave her sleeping." "As long as she likes, the darling," agreed Madame Grégoire. "We will wait." They went down and seated themselves in the easy chairs in the dining room, while the servants, laughing at mademoiselle's sound sleep, kept the chocolate on the stove without grumbling. He took up a newspaper, she knitted a large woollen quilt. It was very hot, and not a sound was heard in the silent house. The Grégoires' fortune, about 40,000 francs a year, was entirely invested in a share of the Montsou mines. They would complacently narrate its origin, which dated from the very formation of the Company. Towards the beginning of the last century there had been a mad search for coal between Lille and Valenciennes. The success of those who held the concession, which was afterwards to become the Anzin Company, had turned all heads. In every commune the ground was tested, and societies were formed and concessions grew up in a night. But among all the obstinate seekers of that epoch, Baron Desrumaux had certainly left the reputation for the most heroic intelligence. For 40 years he had struggled without yielding in the midst of continual obstacles. Early searches, unsuccessful, new pits abandoned at the end of long months of work, landslips which filled up borings, sudden inundations which drowned the workmen, hundreds of thousands of francs thrown into the earth. Then the squabbles of the management, the panics of the shareholders, the struggle with the lords of the soil, who were resolved not to recognize royal concessions if no treaty was first made with themselves. He had at last founded the association of Desrumaux, Fauquenoix and Company, to exploit the Montsou concession, and the pits began to yield a small profit when two neighbouring concessions, that of Cogny belonging to the Comte de Cogny, and that of Joiselle belonging to the Cornille and Jeannard Company, had nearly overwhelmed him beneath the terrible assault of their competition. Happily, on the 25th August 1760, a treaty was made between these three concessions, uniting them into a single one. The Montsou Mining Company was created, such as it still exists to day. In the distribution they had divided the total property, according to the standard of the money of the time, into 24 sous, of which each was subdivided into 12 deniers, which made 288 deniers. And as the denier was worth 10,000 francs, the capital represented a sum of nearly 3 millions. Desrumaux, dying but triumphant, received in this division 6 sous and 3 deniers. In those days the baron possessed Piolaine, which had 300 hectares belonging to it, and he had in his service as steward Honoré Grégoire, a Picardy lad, the great-grandfather of Léon Grégoire, Cécile's father. When the Montsou treaty was made, Honoré, who had laid up savings to the amount of some 50,000 francs, yielded tremblingly to his master's unshakable faith. He took out 10,000 francs in fine crowns, and took a denier, though with the fear of robbing his children of that sum. His son Eugène, in fact, received very small dividends, and as he had become a bourgeois, and had been foolish enough to throw away the other 40,000 francs of the paternal inheritance in a company that came to grief, he lived meanly enough. But the interest of the denier gradually increased. The fortune began with Félicien, who was able to realize a dream with which his grandfather, the old steward, had nursed his childhood, the purchase of dismembered Piolaine, which he acquired as national property for a ludicrous sum. However, bad years followed. It was necessary to await the conclusion of the revolutionary catastrophes, and afterwards Napoleon's bloody fall, and it was Léon Grégoire who profited at a stupefying rate of progress by the timid and uneasy investment of his great grandfather. These poor 10,000 francs grew and multiplied with the Company's prosperity. From 1820 they had brought in 100 per cent, 10,000 francs. In 1844 they had produced 20,000. In 1850, 40. During 2 years the dividend had reached the prodigious figure of 50,000 francs. The value of the denier, quoted at the Lille Bourse at 1,000,000, had centupled in a century. M. Grégoire, who had been advised to sell out when this figure of 1,000,000 was reached, had refused with his smiling paternal air. 6 months later an industrial crisis broke out. The denier fell to 600,000 francs. But he still smiled, he regretted nothing, for the Grégoires had maintained an obstinate faith in their mine. It would rise again. God himself was not so solid. Then with his religious faith was mixed profound gratitude towards an investment which for a century had supported the family in doing nothing. It was like a divinity of their own, whom their egoism surrounded with a kind of worship, the benefactor of the hearth, lulling them in their great bed of idleness, fattening them at their gluttonous table. From father to son it had gone on. Why risk displeasing fate by doubting it? And at the bottom of their fidelity there was a superstitious terror, a fear lest the million of the denier might suddenly melt away if they were to realize it and to put it in a drawer. It seemed to them more sheltered in the earth, from which a race of miners, generations of starving people, extracted it for them a little every day as they needed it. For the rest, happiness reigned on this house. Monsieur Grégoire, when very young, had married the daughter of a Marchiennes druggist, a plain, penniless girl, whom he adored, and who repaid him with happiness. She shut herself up in her household, and worshipped her husband, having no other will but his. No difference of tastes separated them. Their desires were mingled in one idea of comfort, and they had thus lived for 40 years, in affection and little mutual services. It was a well regulated existence. The 40,000 francs were spent quietly, and the savings expended on Cécile, whose tardy birth had for a moment disturbed the budget. They still satisfied all her whims: a second horse, two more carriages, toilettes sent from Paris. But they tasted in this one more joy: they thought nothing too good for their daughter, although they had such a horror of display that they had preserved the fashions of their youth. Every unprofitable expense seemed foolish to them. Suddenly the door opened, and a loud voice called out: "Hallo! What now? Having breakfast without me?" It was Cécile, just come from her bed, her eyes heavy with sleep. She had simply put up her hair and flung on a white woollen dressing gown. "No, no," said the mother. "You see we are all waiting, eh? Has the wind prevented you from sleeping, poor darling?" The young girl looked at her in great surprise. "Has it been windy? I didn't know anything about it. I haven't moved all night." Then they thought this funny, and all three began to laugh. The servants who were bringing in the breakfast also broke out laughing, so amused was the household at the idea that mademoiselle had been sleeping for 12 hours right off. The sight of the brioche completed the expansion of their faces. "What! Is it cooked then?" said Cécile. "That must be a surprise for me. That'll be good now, hot with the chocolate." They sat down to table at last, with the smoking chocolate in their cups, and for a long time talked of nothing but the brioche. Mélanie and Honorine remained to give details about the cooking, and watched them stuffing themselves with greasy lips, saying that it was a pleasure to make a cake when one saw the masters enjoying it so much. But the dogs began to bark loudly. Perhaps they announced the music mistress, who came from Marchiennes on Mondays and Fridays. A professor of literature also came. All the young girl's education was thus carried on at Piolaine in happy ignorance, with her childish whims, throwing the book out of the window as soon as anything wearied her. "It is Monsieur Deneulin," said Honorine, returning. Behind her, Deneulin, a cousin of Monsieur Grégoire's, appeared without ceremony. With his loud voice, his quick gestures, he had the appearance of an old cavalry officer. Although over 50, his short hair and thick moustache were as black as ink. "Yes, it is I. Good day. Don't disturb yourselves." He had sat down amid the family's exclamations. They turned back at last to their chocolate. "Have you anything to tell me?" asked Monsieur Grégoire. "No, nothing at all," Deneulin hastened to reply. "I came out on horseback to rub off the rust a bit, and as I passed your door I thought I would just look in." Cécile questioned him about Jeanne and Lucie, his daughters. They were perfectly well. The first was always at her painting, while the other, the elder, was training her voice at the piano from morning till night. And there was a slight quiver in his voice, a disquiet which he concealed beneath bursts of gaiety. M. Grégoire began again. "And everything goes well at the pit?" "Well, I am upset over this dirty crisis. Ah, we are paying for the prosperous years. They have built too many workshops, put down too many railways, invested too much capital with a view to a large return, and to day the money is asleep. They can't get any more to make the whole thing work. Luckily things are not desperate. I shall get out of it somehow." Like his cousin, he had inherited a denier in the Montsou mines, but being an enterprising engineer, tormented by the desire for a royal fortune, he had hastened to sell out when the denier had reached 1 million. For some months he had been maturing a scheme. His wife possessed, through an uncle, the little concession at Vandame, where only two pits were open, Jean Bart and Gaston Marie, in an abandoned state, and with such defective material that the output hardly covered the cost. Now he was meditating the repair of Jean Bart, the renewal of the engine, and the enlargement of the shaft so as to facilitate the descent, keeping Gaston Marie only for exhaustion purposes. They ought to be able to shovel up gold there, he said. The idea was sound. Only the million had been spent over it, and this damnable industrial crisis broke out at the moment when large profits would have shown that he was right. Besides, he was a bad manager, with a rough kindness towards his workmen, and since his wife's death he allowed himself to be pillaged, and also gave the rein to his daughters, the elder of whom talked of going on the stage, while the younger had already had 3 landscapes refused at the Salon, both of them joyous amid the downfall, and exhibiting in poverty their capacity for good household management. "You see, Léon," he went on in a hesitating voice, "you were wrong not to sell out at the same time as I did. Now everything is going down. You run risk, and if you had confided your money to me, you would have seen what we should have done at Vandame in our mine." M. Grégoire finished his chocolate without haste. He replied peacefully: "Never. You know that I don't want to speculate. I live quietly, and it would be too foolish to worry my head over business affairs. And as for Montsou, it may continue to go down. We shall always get our living out of it. It doesn't do to be so diabolically greedy. Then, listen, it is you who will bite your fingers one day, for Montsou will rise again, and Cécile's grandchildren will still get their white bread out of it." Deneulin listened with a constrained smile. "Then," he murmured, "if I were to ask you to put 100,000 francs in my affair, you would refuse?" But seeing the Grégoires' disturbed faces, he regretted having gone so far. He put off his idea of a loan, reserving it until the case was desperate. "Oh, I have not got to that. It is a joke. Good heavens! Perhaps you are right. The money that other people earn for you is the best to fatten on." They changed the conversation. Cécile spoke again of her cousins, whose tastes interested, while at the same time this shocked her. Madame Grégoire promised to take her daughter to see those dear little ones on the first fine day. Monsieur Grégoire, however, with a distracted air, did not follow the conversation. He added aloud: "If I were in your place I wouldn't persist any more. I would treat with Montsou. They want it, and you will get your money back." He alluded to an old hatred which existed between the concession of Montsou and that of Vandame. In spite of the latter's slight importance, its powerful neighbour was enraged at seeing, enclosed within its own 67 communes, the square league which did not belong to it, and after having vainly tried to kill it, had plotted to buy it at a low price, when in a failing condition. The war continued without truce. Each party stopped its galleries at 200 metres from the other. It was a duel to the last drop of blood, although the managers and engineers maintained polite relations with each other. Deneulin's eyes had flamed up. "Never!" he cried in his turn. "Montsou shall never have Vandame as long as I am alive. I dined on Thursday at Hennebeau's, and I saw him fluttering round me. Last autumn, when the big man came to the administration building, they made me all sorts of advances. Yes, yes, I know them. Those marquises, and dukes, and generals, and ministers, brigands who would take away even your shirt at the corner of a wood." He could not cease. Besides, Monsieur Grégoire did not defend the administration of Montsou. The 6 stewards established by the treaty of 1760, who governed the company despotically, and the 5 survivors of whom on every death chose the new member among the powerful and rich shareholders. The opinion of the owners of Piolaine, with his reasonable ideas, was that these gentlemen were sometimes rather immoderate in their exaggerated love of money. Mélanie had come to clear away the table. Outside the dogs were again barking, and Honorine was going to the door, when Cécile, who was stifled by heat and food, left the table. "No, never mind, it must be for my lesson." Deneulin had also risen. He watched the young girl go out, and asked, smiling: "Well, and the marriage with little Négrel?" "Nothing has been settled," said Madame Grégoire. It is only an idea. We must reflect." "No doubt," he went on, with a gay laugh. "I believe that the nephew and the aunt. What baffles me is that Madame Hennebeau should throw herself so on Cécile's neck." But Monsieur Grégoire was indignant. So distinguished a lady, and 14 years older than the young man! It was monstrous. He did not like joking on such subjects. Deneulin, still laughing, shook hands with him and left. "Not yet," said Cécile, coming back. "It is that woman with the 2 children. You know, mamma, the miner's wife whom we met. Are they to come in here?" They hesitated. Were they very dirty? No, not very, and they would leave their sabots in the porch. Already the father and mother had stretched themselves out in the depths of their large easy chairs. They were digesting there. The fear of change of air decided them. "Let them come in, Henri." Then Maheude and her little ones entered, frozen and hungry, seized by fright on finding themselves in this room which was so warm and smelled so nicely of the brioche. Section 8 of Germinal by Émile Zola. Translation by Havelock Ellis. Recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Ferrard. Part 2, Chapter 2. The room remained shut up, and the shutters had allowed gradual streaks of daylight to form a fan on the ceiling. The confined air stupefied them so that they continued their night's slumber. Lénore and Henri in each other's arms, Alzire with her head back, lying on her hump, while Father Bonnemort, having the bed of Zacharie and Jeanlin to himself, snored with open mouth. No sound came from the closet where Maheude had gone to sleep again while suckling Estelle, her breast hanging to one side, the child lying across her belly, stuffed with milk, overcome also and stifling in the soft flesh of the bosom. The clock below struck 6. Along the front of the settlement one heard the sound of doors, then the clatter of sabots along the pavements. The screening women were going to the pit, and silence again fell until 7 o'clock. Then shutters were drawn back, yawns and coughs were heard through the walls. For a long time a coffee mill scraped, but no one awoke in the room. Suddenly a sound of blows and shouts, far away, made Alzire sit up. She was conscious of the time, and ran barefooted to shake her mother. "Mother, mother, it is late! You have to go out! Take care, you are crushing Estelle!" And she saved the child, half stifled beneath the enormous mass of the breasts. "Good gracious!" stammered Maheude, rubbing her eyes. "I'm so knocked up I could sleep all day. Dress Lénore and Henri. I'll take them with me, and you can take care of Estelle. I don't want to drag her along for fear of hurting her, this dog's weather." She hastily washed herself, and put on an old blue skirt, her cleanest, and a loose jacket of grey wool in which she had made 2 patches the evening before. "And the soup! Good gracious!" she muttered again. When her mother had gone down, upsetting everything, Alzire went back into the room, taking with her Estelle, who had begun screaming. But she was used to the little one's rages. At 8 she had all a woman's tender cunning in soothing and amusing her. She gently placed her in her still warm bed, and put her to sleep again, giving her a finger to suck. It was time, for now another disturbance broke out, and she had to make peace between Lénore and Henri, who at last awoke. These children could never get on together. It was only when they were asleep that they put their hands round one another's necks. The girl, who was 6 years old, as soon as she was awake set on the boy, her junior by 2 years, who received her blows without returning them. Both of them had the same kind of head, which was too large for them, as if blown out, with disorderly yellow hair. Alzire had to pull her sister by the legs, threatening to take the skin off her bottom. Then there was stamping over the washing, and over every garment that she put on to them. The shutters remained closed, so as not to disturb Father Bonnemort's sleep. He went on snoring amid the children's frightful clatter. "It's ready. Are you coming, up there?" shouted Maheude. She had put back the blinds and stirred up the fire, adding some coal to it. Her hope was that the old man had not swallowed all the soup. But she found the saucepan dry, and cooked a handful of vermicelli which she had been keeping for 3 days in reserve. They could swallow it with water, without butter, as there could not be any remaining from the day before, and she was surprised to find that Catherine in preparing the bricks had performed the miracle of leaving a piece as large as a nut. But this time the cupboard was indeed empty. Nothing, not a crust, not an odd fragment, not a bone to gnaw. What was to become of them if Maigrat persisted in cutting short their credit, and if the Piolaine people would not give them the 5 francs? When the men and the girl returned from the pit they would want to eat, for unfortunately it had not yet been found out how to live without eating. "Come down, will you?" she cried out, getting angry. "I ought to be gone by this." When Alzire and the children were there, she divided the vermicelli in 3 small portions. She herself was not hungry, she said. Although Catherine had already poured water on the coffee dregs of the day before, she did so over again, and swallowed 2 large glasses of coffee so weak that it looked like rusty water. That would keep her up all the same. "Listen," she repeated to Alzire, "you must let your grandfather sleep. You must watch that Estelle does not knock her head, and if she wakes, or if she howls too much, here, take this bit of sugar and melt it and give it her in spoonfuls. I know that you are sensible and won't eat it yourself." "And school, mother?" "School! Well, that must be left for another day. I want you." "And the soup, would you like me to make it if you come back late?" "Soup! Soup! No, wait till I come." Alzire, with the precocious intelligence of a little invalid girl, could make soup very well. She must have understood, for she did not insist. Now the whole settlement was awake. Bands of children were going to school, and one heard the trailing noise of their clogs. 8 o'clock struck, and a growing murmur of chatter arose on the left, among the Levaque people. The women were commencing their day around the coffee pots, with their fists on their hips, their tongues turning without ceasing, like millstones. A faded head, with thick lips and flattened nose, was pressed against a window pane, calling out: "Got some news? Stop a bit." "No, no, later on," replied Maheude. "I have to go out." And for fear of giving way to the offer of a glass of hot coffee, she pushed Lénore and Henri and set out with them. Up above, Father Bonnemort was still snoring with a rhythmic snore which rocked the house. Outside, Maheude was surprised to find that the wind was no longer blowing. There had been a sudden thaw, the sky was earth coloured, the walls were sticky with greenish moisture, and the roads were covered with pitch like mud, a special kind of mud peculiar to the coal country, as black as diluted soot, thick and tenacious enough to pull off her sabots. Suddenly she boxed Lénore's ears, because the little one amused herself by piling the mud on her clogs as on the end of a shovel. On leaving the settlement, she had gone along by the pit bank, and followed the road of the canal, making a short cut through broken up paths, across rough country shut in by mossy palings. Sheds succeeded one another, long workshop buildings, tall chimneys spitting out soot, and soiling this ravaged suburb of an industrial district. Behind a clump of poplars, the old Réquillart pit exhibited its crumbling steeple, of which the large skeleton alone stood upright. And turning to the right, Maheude found herself on the high road. "Stop, stop, dirty pig! I'll teach you to make mincemeat." Now it was Henri, who had taken a handful of mud and was moulding it. The 2 children had their ears impartially boxed, and were brought into good order, looking out of the corner of their eyes at the mud pies they had made. They dragged along, already exhausted by their efforts to unstick their shoes at every step. On the Marchiennes side the road unrolled its 2 leagues of pavement, which stretched straight as a ribbon soaked in cart grease between the reddish fields. But on the other side it went winding down through Montsou, which was built on the slope of a large undulation in the plain. These roads in the Nord, drawn like a string between manufacturing towns, with their slight curves, their slow ascents, gradually get lined with houses and tend to make the department one laborious city. The little brick houses, daubed over to enliven the climate, some yellow, others blue, others black, the last, no doubt, in order to reach at once their final shade, went serpentining down to right and to left to the bottom of the slope. A few large two-story villas, the dwellings of the heads of the workshops, made gaps in the serried line of narrow façades. A church, also of brick, looked like a new model of a large furnace, with its square tower already stained by the floating coal dust. And amid the sugar works, the rope works, and the flour mills, there stood out ballrooms, restaurants, and beer shops, which were so numerous that to every 1,000 houses there were more than 500 inns. As she approached the Company's yards, a vast series of storehouses and workshops, Maheude decided to take Henri and Lénore by the hand, one on the right, the other on the left. Beyond was situated the house of the director, M. Hennebeau, a sort of vast chalet, separated from the road by a grating, and then a garden in which some lean trees vegetated. Just then a carriage had stopped before the door, and a gentleman with decorations and a lady in a fur cloak alighted. Visitors just arrived from Paris at the Marchiennes station, for Madame Hennebeau, who appeared in the shadow of the porch, was uttering exclamations of surprise and joy. "Come along then, dawdlers," growled Maheude, pulling the two little ones who were standing in the mud. When she arrived at Maigrat's she was quite excited. Maigrat lived close to the manager. Only a wall separated the latter's ground from his own small house, and he had there a warehouse, a long building which opened on to the road as a shop without a front. He kept everything there, grocery, cooked meats, fruit, and sold bread, beer, and saucepans. Formerly an overseer at the Voreux, he had started with a small canteen. Then, thanks to the protection of his superiors, his business had enlarged, gradually killing the Montsou retail trade. He centralized merchandise, and the considerable custom of the settlements enabled him to sell more cheaply and to give longer credit. Besides, he had remained in the Company's hands, and they had built his small house and his shop. "Here I am again, Monsieur Maigrat," said Maheude humbly, finding him standing in front of his door. He looked at her without replying. He was a stout, cold, polite man, and he prided himself on never changing his mind. "Now you won't send me away again, like yesterday. We must have bread from now to Saturday. Sure enough, we owe you 60 francs these 2 years." She explained in short, painful phrases. It was an old debt contracted during the last strike. 20 times over they had promised to settle it, but they had not been able. They could not even give him 40 sous a fortnight. And then a misfortune had happened 2 days before. She had been obliged to pay 20 francs to a shoemaker who threatened to seize their things. And that was why they were without a sou. Otherwise they would have been able to go on until Saturday, like the others. Maigrat, with protruded belly and folded arms, shook his head at every supplication. "Only 2 loaves, Monsieur Maigrat. I am reasonable. I don't ask for coffee. Only 2 3-pound loaves a day." "No!" he shouted at last, at the top of his voice. His wife had appeared, a pitiful creature who passed all her days over a ledger, without even daring to lift her head. She moved away, frightened at seeing this unfortunate woman turning her ardent, beseeching eyes towards her. It was said that she yielded the conjugal bed to the putters among the customers. It was a known fact that when a miner wished to prolong his credit, he had only to send his daughter or his wife, plain or pretty, it mattered not, provided they were complaisant. Maheude, still imploring Maigrat with her look, felt herself uncomfortable under the pale keenness of his small eyes, which seemed to undress her. It made her angry. She would have understood before she had had 7 children, when she was young. And she went off, violently dragging Lénore and Henri, who were occupied in picking up nutshells from the gutter, where they were making investigations. "This won't bring you luck, Monsieur Maigret. Remember, now there only remain the Piolaine people. If these would not throw her a 5 franc piece, she might as well lie down and die." She had taken the Joiselle road on the left. The administration building was there at the corner of the road, a veritable brick palace, where the great people from Paris, princes and generals and members of the government, came every autumn to give large dinners. As she walked she was already spending the 5 francs, first bread, then coffee, afterwards a quarter of butter, a bushel of potatoes for the morning soup and the evening stew, finally, perhaps, a bit of pig's chitterlings, for the father needed meat. The curé of Montsou, Abbé Joire, was passing, holding up his cassock with the delicate air of a fat, well nourished cat afraid of wetting its fur. He was a mild man, who pretended not to interest himself in anything, so as not to vex either the workers or the masters. "Good day, Monsieur le Curé." Without stopping he smiled at the children, and left her planted in the middle of the road. She was not religious, but she had suddenly imagined that this priest would give her something. And the journey began again through the black, sticky mud. There were still 2 kilometres to walk, and the little ones dragged behind more than ever, for they were frightened, and no longer amused themselves. To right and to left of the path the same vague landscape unrolled, enclosed within mossy palings. The same factory buildings, dirty with smoke, bristling with tall chimneys. Then the flat land was spread out in immense open fields, like an ocean of brown clods, without a tree trunk, as far as the purplish line of the forest of Vandame. "Carry me, mother." She carried them one after the other. Puddles made holes in the pathway, and she pulled up her clothes, fearful of arriving too dirty. 3 times she nearly fell, so sticky was that confounded pavement. And as they at last arrived before the porch, 2 enormous dogs threw themselves upon them, barking so loudly that the little ones yelled with terror. The coachman was obliged to take a whip to them. "Leave your sabots and come in," repeated Honorine. In the dining room the mother and children stood motionless, dazed by the sudden heat, and very constrained beneath the gaze of this old lady and gentleman, who were stretched out in their easy chairs. "Cécile," said the old lady, "fulfil your little duties." The Grégoires charged Cécile with their charities. It was part of their idea of a good education. One must be charitable. They said themselves that their house was the house of God. Besides, they flattered themselves that they performed their charity with intelligence, and they were exercised by a constant fear lest they should be deceived, and so encourage vice. So they never gave money, never! Not 10 sous, not 2 sous, for it is a well known fact that as soon as a poor man gets 2 sous he drinks them. Their alms were, therefore, always in kind, especially in warm clothing, distributed during the winter to needy children. "Oh, the poor dears!" exclaimed Cécile. "How pale they are from the cold! Honorine, go and look for the parcel in the cupboard." The servants were also gazing at these miserable creatures with the pity and vague uneasiness of girls who are in no difficulty about their own dinners. While the housemaid went upstairs, the cook forgot her duties, leaving the rest of the brioche on the table, and stood there swinging her empty hands. "I still have 2 woollen dresses and some comforters," Cécile went on. "You will see how warm they will be, the poor dears." Then Maheude found her tongue, and stammered: "Thank you so much, mademoiselle. You are all too good." Tears had filled her eyes. She thought herself sure of the 5 francs, and was only preoccupied by the way in which she would ask for them if they were not offered to her. The housemaid did not reappear, and there was a moment of embarrassed silence. From the mother's skirts the little ones opened their eyes wide and gazed at the brioche. "You only have these 2?" asked Madame Grégoire, in order to break the silence. "Oh, madame, I have 7." Monsieur Grégoire, who had gone back to his newspaper, sat up indignantly. "7 children! But why? Good God!" "It is imprudent," murmured the old lady. Maheude made a vague gesture of apology. "What would you have? One doesn't think about it at all; they come quite naturally." And then, when they grow up, they bring something in, and that makes the household go. Take their case. They could get on, if it was not for the grandfather, who was getting quite stiff, and if it was not that among the lot only two of her sons and her eldest daughter were old enough to go down into the pit. It was necessary, all the same, to feed the little ones who brought nothing in. "Then," said Madame Grégoire, "you have worked for a long time at the mines?" A silent laugh lit up Maheude's pale face. Ah, yes, I went down till I was 20. The doctors said that I should stay down for good after I had been confined the second time, because it seems that made something go wrong in my inside. Besides, then I got married, and I had enough to do in the house. But on my husband's side, you see, they have been down there for ages. It goes up from grandfather to grandfather, one doesn't know how far back. Quite to the beginning, when they first took the pick down there at Réquillart." Monsieur Grégoire thoughtfully contemplated this woman and these pitiful children, with their waxy flesh, their discoloured hair, the degeneration which stunted them, gnawed by anaemia, and with the melancholy ugliness of starvelings. There was silence again, and one only heard the burning coal as it gave out a jet of gas. The moist room had that heavy air of comfort in which our middle class nooks of happiness slumber. "What is she doing, then?" exclaimed Cécile impatiently. "Mélanie, go up and tell her that the parcel is at the bottom of the cupboard, on the left." In the meanwhile, M. Grégoire repeated aloud the reflections inspired by the sight of these starving ones. "There is evil in this world, it is quite true. But, my good woman, it must also be said that workpeople are never prudent. Thus, instead of putting aside a few sous like our peasants, miners drink, get into debt, and end by not having enough to support their families." "Monsieur is right," replied Maheude sturdily. "They don't always keep to the right path. That's what I'm always saying to the ne'er do wells when they complain. Now, I have been lucky, my husband doesn't drink. All the same, on feast Sundays he sometimes takes a drop too much, but it never goes farther. It is all the nicer of him, since before our marriage he drank like a hog, begging your pardon. And yet, you know, it doesn't help us much that he is so sensible. There are days like to day when you might turn out all the drawers in the house and not find a farthing." She wished to suggest to them the idea of the 5 franc piece, and went on in her low voice, explaining the fatal debt, small at first, then large and overwhelming. They paid regularly for many fortnights, but one day they got behind, and then it was all up. They could never catch up again. The gulf widened, and the men became disgusted with work which did not even allow them to pay their way. Do what they could, there was nothing but difficulties until death. Besides, it must be understood that a collier needed a glass to wash away the dust. It began there, and then he was always in the end when worries came. Without complaining of any one, it might be that the workmen did not earn as much as they ought to. "I thought," said Madame Grégoire, "that the Company gave you lodging and firing." Maheude glanced sideways at the gleaming coal in the fireplace. "Yes, yes, they give us coal, not very grand, but it burns. As to lodging, it only costs 6 francs a month. That sounds like nothing, but it is often pretty hard to pay. To day, they might cut me up into bits without getting 2 sous out of me. Where there's nothing, there's nothing." The lady and gentleman were silent, softly stretched out, and gradually wearied and disquieted by the exhibition of this wretchedness. She feared she had wounded them, and added, with the stolid and just air of a practical woman: "Oh, I didn't want to complain. Things are like this, and one has to put up with them. All the more that it's no good struggling, perhaps we shouldn't change anything. The best is it not, to try and live honestly in the place in which the good God has put us?" Monsieur Grégoire approved this emphatically. "With such sentiments, my good woman, one is above misfortune." Honorine and Mélanie at last brought the parcel. Cécile unfastened it and took out the 2 dresses. She added comforters, even stockings and mittens. They would all fit beautifully, she hastened, and made the servants wrap up the chosen garments. For her music mistress had just arrived. and she pushed the mother and children towards the door. "We are very short," stammered Maheude. "If we only had a 5 franc piece!" The phrase was stifled, for the Maheus were proud and never begged. Cécile looked uneasily at her father, but the latter refused decisively, with an air of duty. "No, it is not our custom. We cannot do it." Then the young girl, moved by the mother's overwhelmed face, wished to do all she could for the children. They were still looking fixedly at the brioche. She cut it in two and gave it to them. "Here, this is for you." Then, taking the pieces back, she asked for an old newspaper. "Wait, you must share with your brothers and sisters." And beneath the tender gaze of her parents she finally pushed them out of the room. The poor starving urchins went off, holding the brioche respectfully in their benumbed little hands. Maheude dragged her children along the road, seeing neither the desert fields, nor the black mud, nor the great livid sky. As she passed through Montsou she resolutely entered Maigrat's shop, and begged so persistently that at last she carried away 2 loaves, coffee, butter, and even her 5 franc piece, for the man also lent money by the week. It was not her that he wanted, it was Catherine. She understood that when he advised her to send her daughter for provisions. They would see about that. Catherine would box his ears if he came too close under her nose. Section 9 of Germinal by Émile Zola, translated by Havelock Ellis. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Memberard. Part 2, Chapter 3. 11 o'clock struck at the little church in the Deux Cent Quarante settlement, a brick chapel to which Abbé Joire came to say mass on Sundays. In the school beside it, also of brick, one heard the faltering voices of the children, in spite of windows closed against the outside cold. The wide passages, divided into little gardens back to back, between the 4 large blocks of uniform houses, were deserted, and these gardens, devastated by the winter, exhibited the destitution of their marly soil, lumped and spotted by the last vegetables. They were making soup, chimneys were smoking, a woman appeared at distant intervals along the fronts, opened a door and disappeared. From one end to the other, on the pavement, the pipes dripped into tubs, although it was no longer raining, so charged was this grey sky with moistness. And the village, built altogether in the midst of the vast plain, and edged by its black roads as by a mourning border, had no touch of joyousness about it, save the regular bands of its red tiles, constantly washed by showers. When Maheude returned, she went out of her way to buy potatoes from an overseer's wife whose crop was not yet exhausted. Behind a curtain of sickly poplars, the only trees in these flat regions, was a group of isolated buildings, houses placed 4 together, and surrounded by their gardens. As the Company reserved this new experiment for the captains, the workpeople called this corner of the hamlet the settlement of the Pas de Souci, just as they called their own settlement Paix des Dettes, in good humoured irony of their wretchedness. "Eh, here we are," said Maheude, laden with parcels, pushing in Lénore and Henri, covered with mud and quite tired out. In front of the fire Estelle was screaming, cradled in Alzire's arms. The latter, having no more sugar and not knowing how to soothe her, had decided to pretend to give her the breast. This ruse often succeeded, but this time it was in vain for her to open her dress, and to press the mouth against the lean breast of an 8-year-old invalid. The child was enraged at biting the skin and drawing nothing. "Pass her to me," cried the mother as soon as she found herself free. "She won't let us say a word." When she had taken from her bodice a breast as heavy as a leather bottle, to the neck of which the brawler hung, suddenly silent, they were at last able to talk. Otherwise everything was going on well. The little housekeeper had kept up the fire and had swept and arranged the room. And in the silence they heard upstairs the grandfather snoring, the same rhythmic snoring which had not stopped for a moment. "What a lot of things!" murmured Alzire, smiling at the provisions. "If you like, mother, I'll make the soup." The table was encumbered: a parcel of clothes, 2 loaves, potatoes, butter, coffee, chicory, and half a pound of pig's chitterlings. "Oh, the soup!" said Maheude with an air of fatigue. "We must gather some sorrel and pull up some leeks. No, I will make some for the men afterwards. Put some potatoes on to boil. We'll eat them with a little butter and some coffee, eh? Don't forget the coffee." But suddenly she thought of the brioche. She looked at the empty hands of Lénore and Henri, who were fighting on the floor, already rested and lively. These gluttons had slyly eaten the brioche on the road. She boxed their ears, while Alzire, who was putting the saucepan on the fire, tried to appease her. "Let them be, mother. If the brioche was for me, you know I don't mind a bit. They were hungry, walking so far." Midday struck. They heard the clogs of the children coming out of school. The potatoes were cooked, and the coffee, thickened by a good half of chicory, was passing through the percolator with a singing noise of large drops. One corner of the table was free, but the mother only was eating there. The 3 children were satisfied with their knees, and all the time the little boy with silent voracity looked, without saying anything, at the chitterlings, excited by the greasy paper. Maheude was drinking her coffee in little sips, with her hands round the glass to warm them, when Father Bonnemort came down. Usually he rose late, and his breakfast waited for him on the fire. But to day he began to grumble because there was no soup. Then, when his daughter in law said to him that one cannot always do what one likes, he ate his potatoes in silence. From time to time he got up to spit in the ashes for cleanliness, and, settled in his chair, he rolled his food round in his mouth, with lowered head and dull eyes. "Ah, I forgot, mother," said Alzire. "The neighbour came." Her mother interrupted her. "She bothers me." There was a deep rancour against the Levaque woman, who had pleaded poverty the day before to avoid lending her anything, while she knew that she was just then in comfort, since her lodger, Bouteloup, had paid his fortnight in advance. In the settlement they did not usually lend from household to household. "Here, you remind me," said Maheude. "Wrap up a millful of coffee. I will take it to Pierronne. I owe it her from the day before yesterday." And when her daughter had prepared the packet, she added that she would come back immediately to put the men's soup on the fire. Then she went out with Estelle in her arms, leaving old Bonnemort to chew his potatoes leisurely, while Lénore and Henri fought for the fallen parings. Instead of going round, Maheude went straight across through the gardens, for fear lest Levaque's wife should call her. Her garden was just next to that of the Pierrons, and in the dilapidated trellis work which separated them there was a hole through which they fraternized. The common well was there, serving 4 households. Beside it, behind a clump of feeble lilacs, was situated the shed, a low building full of old tools, in which were brought up the rabbits which were eaten on feast days. 1 o'clock struck. It was the hour for coffee, and not a soul was to be seen at the doors or windows. Only a workman belonging to the earth cutting, waiting the hour for descent, was digging up his patch of vegetable ground without raising his head. But as Maheude arrived opposite the other block of buildings, she was surprised to see a gentleman and 2 ladies in front of the church. She stopped a moment and recognized them. It was Madame Hennebeau, bringing her guests, the decorated gentleman and the lady in the fur mantle, to see the settlement. "Oh, why did you take this trouble?" exclaimed Pierronne, when Maheude had returned the coffee. "There was no hurry." She was 28, and was considered the beauty of the settlement, dark with a low forehead, large eyes, straight mouth, and coquettish as well, with the neatness of a cat, and with a good figure, for she had had no children. Her mother, Brulé, the widow of a pikeman who died in the mine, after having sent her daughter to work in a factory, swearing that she should never marry a collier, had never ceased to be angry since she had married, somewhat late, Pierronne, a widower with a girl of 8. However, the household lived very happily in the midst of chatter, of scandals which circulated concerning the husband's complaisance and the wife's lovers. No debts, meat twice a week, a house kept so clean that one could see oneself in the saucepans. As an additional piece of luck, thanks to favours, the Company had authorized her to sell bonbons and biscuits, jars of which she exhibited on two boards behind the window panes. There was 6 or 7 sous profit a day, and sometimes 12 on Sundays. The only drawback to all this happiness was Mother Brulé, who screamed with all the rage of an old revolutionary having to avenge the death of her man on the masters, and little Lydie, who pocketed, in the shape of frequent blows, the passions of the family. "How big she is already!" said Pierron, simpering at Estelle. "Oh, the trouble that it gives! Don't talk of it," said Maheude. "You are lucky not to have any. At least you can keep clean." Although everything was in order in her house, and she scrubbed every Saturday, she glanced with a jealous housekeeper's eye over this clean room, in which there was even a certain coquetry, gilt vases on the sideboard, a mirror, 3 framed prints. Pierron was about to drink her coffee alone, all her people being at the pit. "You'll have a glass with me?" she said. "No, thanks. I've just swallowed mine." "What does that matter?" In fact, it mattered nothing, and both began drinking slowly. Between the jars of biscuits and bonbons their eyes rested on the opposite houses, of which the little curtains in the windows formed a row, revealing by their greater or less whiteness the virtues of the housekeepers. Those of the Levaques were very dirty, veritable kitchen clouts, which seemed to have wiped the bottoms of the saucepans. "How can they live in such dirt?" murmured Pierron. Then Maheude began, and did not stop. Ah, if she had had a lodger like that Bouteloup, she would have made the household go. When one knew how to do it, a lodger was an excellent thing. Only one ought not to sleep with him. And then the husband had taken to drink, beat his wife, and ran after the singers at the Montsou Café concerts. Pierron assumed an air of profound disgust. These singers gave all sorts of diseases. There was one at Joiselle who had infected a whole pit. "What surprises me is that you let your son go with their girl." "Ah, yes; but just stop it then. Their garden is next to ours. Zacharie was always there in summer with Philoméne behind the lilacs, and they didn't put themselves out on the shed. One couldn't draw water at the well without surprising them." It was the usual history of the promiscuities of the settlement. Boys and girls became corrupted together, throwing themselves on their backsides, as they said, on the low, sloping roof of the shed when twilight came on. All the putters got their first child there when they did not take the trouble to go to Réquillart or into the cornfields. It was of no consequence. They married afterwards, only the mothers were angry when their lads began too soon, for a lad who married no longer brought anything into the family. "In your place I would have done with it," said Pierron sensibly. "Your Zacharie has already filled her twice, and they will go on and get spliced. Anyhow, the money is gone." Maheude was furious and raised her hands. "Listen to this! I will curse them if they get spliced. Doesn't Zacharie owe us any respect? He has cost us something, hasn't he? Very well, he must return it before getting a wife to hang on him. What will become of us, eh, if our children begin at once to work for others? Might as well die." However, she grew calm. "And speaking in a general way, we shall see later. It is fine and strong, your coffee. You make it proper." And after a quarter of an hour spent over other stories, she ran off, exclaiming that the men's soup was not yet made. Outside, the children were going back to school. A few women were showing themselves at their doors, looking at Madame Hennebeau, who, with lifted finger, was explaining the settlement to her guests. This visit began to stir up the village. The earth cutting man stopped digging for a moment, and 2 disturbed fowls took fright in the gardens. As Maheude returned, she ran against the Levaque woman who had come out to stop Dr. Vanderhaghen, a doctor of the Company, a small, hurried man, overwhelmed by work, who gave his advice as he walked. "Sir," she said, "I can't sleep. I feel ill everywhere. I must tell you about it." He spoke to them all familiarly, and replied without stopping: "Just leave me alone. You drink too much coffee." "And my husband, sir," said Maheude in her turn. "You must come and see him. He always has those pains in his legs." "It is you who take too much out of him. Just leave me alone." The two women were left to gaze at the doctor's retreating back. "Come in, then," said the Levaque woman, when she had exchanged a despairing shrug with her neighbour. "You know there is something new. And you will take a little coffee. It is quite fresh." Maheude refused, but without energy. "Well, a drop, at all events, not to disoblige." And she entered. The room was black with dirt, the floor and the walls spotted with grease, the sideboard and the table sticky with filth, and the stink of a badly kept house took you by the throat. Near the fire, with his elbows on the table and his nose in his plate, Bouteloup, a broad, stout, placid man, still young for 35, was finishing the remains of his boiled beef, while standing in front of him, little Achille, Philoméne's firstborn, who was already in his third year, was looking at him in the silent, supplicating way of a gluttonous animal. The lodger, very kind behind his big brown beard, from time to time stuffed a piece of meat into his mouth. "Wait till I sugar it," said the Levaque woman, putting some brown sugar beforehand into the coffee pot. 6 years older than he was, she was hideous and worn out, with her bosom hanging on her belly, and her belly on her thighs, with a flattened muzzle and greyish hair always uncombed. He had taken her naturally, without choosing, the same as he did his soup, in which he found hairs, or his bed, of which the sheets lasted for 3 months. She was part of the lodging. The husband liked repeating that good reckonings make good friends. "I was going to tell you," she went on, "that Pierron was seen yesterday prowling about on the Bas de Soie side. The gentleman you know of was waiting for her behind Rasseneur's, and they went off together along the canal. Eh, that's nice, isn't it? A married woman!" "Gracious!" said Maheude. "Pierron, before marrying her, used to give the captain rabbits. Now it costs him less to lend his wife." Bouteloup began to laugh enormously, and threw a fragment of sauced bread into Achille's mouth. The two women went on relieving themselves with regard to Pierron, a flirt no prettier than any one else, but always occupied in looking after every freckle of her skin, in washing herself and putting on pomade. Anyhow, it was the husband's affair, if he liked that sort of thing. There were men so ambitious that they would wipe the masters' behinds to hear them say thank you. And they were only interrupted by the arrival of a neighbour bringing in a little urchin of 9 months, Désirée, Philoméne's youngest. Philoméne, taking her breakfast at the screening shed, had arranged that they should bring her little one down here, where she suckled it, seated for a moment in the cold. "I can't leave mine for a moment, she screams directly," said Maheude, looking at Estelle, who was asleep in her arms. But she did not succeed in avoiding the domestic affair which she had read in the other's eyes. "I say, now we ought to get that settled." At first the two mothers, without need for talking about it, had agreed not to conclude the marriage. If Zacharie's mother wished to get her son's wages as long as possible, Philoméne's mother was enraged at the idea of abandoning her daughter's wages. There was no hurry. The second mother had even preferred to keep the little one, as long as there was only one; but when it began to grow and eat and another one came, she found that she was losing, and furiously pushed on the marriage, like a woman who does not care to throw away her money. "Zacharie has drawn his lot," she went on, "and there's nothing in the way. When shall it be?" "Wait till the fine weather," replied Maheude constrainedly. "They are a nuisance, these affairs. As if they couldn't wait to be married before going together. My word! I would strangle Catherine if I knew that she had done that." The other woman shrugged her shoulders. "Let be, she'll do like the others." Bouteloup, with the tranquillity of a man who is at home, searched about on the dresser for bread. Vegetables for Levaque's soup, potatoes and leeks, lay about on a corner of the table, half peeled, taken up and dropped a dozen times in the midst of continual gossiping. The woman was about to go on with them again, when she dropped them anew and planted herself before the window. "What's that there? Why, there's Madame Hennebeau with some people. They are going into Pierronne's." At once both of them started again on the subject of Pierronne. Ah! Whenever the Company brought any visitors to the settlement they never failed to go straight to her place, because it was clean. No doubt they never told them stories about the head captain. One can afford to be clean when one has lovers who earn 3,000 francs and are lodged and warmed without counting presents. If it was clean above, it was not clean underneath. And all the time that the visitors remained opposite, they went on chattering. "There, they are coming out," said the Levaque woman at last. "They are going all around. Why, look, my dear, I believe they are going into your place." Maheude was seized with fear. Who knows whether Alzire had sponged over the table? And her soup, also, which was not yet ready! She stammered a good day and ran off home without a single glance aside. But everything was bright. Alzire, very seriously, with a cloth in front of her, had set about making the soup, seeing that her mother did not return. She had pulled up the last leeks from the garden, gathered the sorrel, and was just then cleaning the vegetables, while a large kettle on the fire was heating the water for the men's baths when they should return. Henri and Lénore were good for once, being absorbed in tearing up an old almanac. Father Bonnemort was smoking his pipe in silence. As Maheude was getting her breath, Madame Hennebeau knocked. "You will allow me, will you not, my good woman?" Tall and fair, a little heavy in her superb maturity of 40 years, she smiled with an effort of affability, without showing too prominently her fear of soiling her bronze silk dress and black velvet mantle. Come in," she said to her guests. "We are not disturbing any one. Now, isn't this clean again? And this good woman has 7 children. All our households are like this. I ought to explain to you that the Company rents them the house at 6 francs a month, a large room on the ground floor, 2 rooms above, a cellar and a garden." The decorated gentleman and the lady in the fur cloak, arrived that morning by train from Paris, opened their eyes vaguely, exhibiting on their faces their astonishment at all these new things which took them out of their element. "And a garden!" repeated the lady. "One could live here. It is charming." "We give them more coal than they can burn," went on Madame Hennebeau. "A doctor visits them twice a week, and when they are old they receive pensions, although nothing is held back from their wages." "A Thibault! A real land of milk and honey!" murmured the gentleman in delight. Maheude had hastened to offer chairs. The ladies refused. Madame Hennebeau was already getting tired, happy for a moment to amuse herself in the weariness of her exile by playing the part of exhibiting the beasts, but immediately disgusted by the sickly odour of wretchedness, in spite of the special cleanliness of the houses into which she ventured. Besides, she was only repeating odd phrases which she had overheard, without ever troubling herself further about this race of workpeople who were labouring and suffering beside her. "What beautiful children!" murmured the lady, who thought them hideous, with their large heads beneath their bushy, straw coloured hair. And Maheude had to tell their ages. They also asked her questions about Estelle, out of politeness. Father Bonnemort respectfully took his pipe out of his mouth, but he was not the less a subject of uneasiness, so worn out by his 40 years underground, with his stiff limbs, deformed body, and earthy face. And as a violent spasm of coughing took him, he preferred to go and spit outside, with the idea that his black expectoration would make people uncomfortable. Alzire received all the compliments. What an excellent little housekeeper, with her cloth! They congratulated the mother on having a little daughter so sensible for her age, and none spoke of the hump, though looks of uneasy compassion were constantly turned towards the poor little invalid. "Now," concluded Madame Hennebeau, "if they ask you about our settlements at Paris, you will know what to reply. Never more noise than this. Patriarchal manners, all happy and well off as you see. A place where you might come to recruit a little on account of the good air and the tranquillity." "It is marvellous, marvellous!" exclaimed the gentleman, in a final outburst of enthusiasm. They left with that enchanted air with which people leave a booth in a fair, and Maheude, who accompanied them, remained on the threshold while they went away slowly, talking very loudly. The streets were full of people, and they had to pass through several groups of women, attracted by the news of their visit, which was hawked from house to house. Just then, Levaque, in front of her door, had stopped Pierron, who was drawn by curiosity. Both of them affected a painful surprise. What now? Were these people going to bed at the Maheus'? But it was not so very delightful a place. Always without a sou, with all that they earn. Lord, when people have vices! I have just heard that she went this morning to beg at Piolaine, and Maigrat, who had refused them bread, has given them something. We know how Maigrat pays himself. On her? Oh, no, that would need some courage. It's Catherine that he's after. Why, did she have the cheek to say just now that she would strangle Catherine if she were to come to that? As if big Chaval for ever so long had not put her backside on the shed. Hush, here they are. Then Levaque and Pierron, with a peaceful air and without impolite curiosity, contented themselves with watching the visitors out of the corners of their eyes. Then by a gesture they quickly called Maheude, who was still carrying Estelle in her arms. And all three, motionless, watched the well-clad backs of Madame Hennebeau and her guests slowly disappear. When they were some 30 paces off, the gossiping recommenced with redoubled vigour. They carry plenty of money on their skins, worth more than themselves, perhaps. Ah, sure, I don't know the other, but the one that belongs here, I wouldn't give 4 sous for her, big as she is. They do tell stories." "Eh? What stories?" "Why, she has men. First the engineer." "That lean little creature? Oh, he's too small. She would lose him in the sheets." "What does that matter, if it amuses her? I don't trust a woman who puts on such proud airs and never seems to be pleased where she is. Just look how she wags her rump, as if she felt contempt for us all. Is that nice?" The visitors went along at the same slow pace, still talking, when a carriage stopped in the road, before the church. A gentleman of about 48 got out of it, dressed in a black frock coat, and with a very dark complexion and an authoritative, correct expression. "The husband," murmured Levaque, lowering her voice, as if he could hear her, seized by that hierarchical fear which the manager inspired in his 10,000 workpeople. "It's true, though, that he has a cuckold's head, that man." Now the whole settlement was out of doors. The curiosity of the women increased. The groups approached each other, and were melted into one crowd, while bands of urchins, with unwiped noses and gaping mouths, dawdled along the pavements. For a moment the schoolmaster's pale head was also seen behind the schoolhouse hedge. Among the gardens the man who was digging stood with one foot on his spade and with rounded eyes. And the murmur of gossiping gradually increased, with the sound of rattles like a gust of wind among dry leaves. It was especially before the Levaque's door that the crowd was thickest. 2 women had come forward, then 10, then 20. Pierron was prudently silent now that there were too many ears about. Maheude, one of the more reasonable, also contented herself with looking on, and to calm Estelle, who was awake and screaming, she had tranquilly drawn out her suckling animal's breast, which hung swaying as if pulled down by the continual running of its milk. When M. Hennebeau had seated the ladies in the carriage, which went off in the direction of Marchiennes, there was a final explosion of clattering voices, all the women gesticulating and talking in each other's faces in the midst of a tumult as of an ant hill in revolution. But 3 o'clock struck. The workers of the earth cutting, Bouteloup and the others, had set out. Suddenly around the church appeared the first colliers, returning from the pit with black faces and damp garments, folding their arms and expanding their backs. Then there was confusion among the women. They all began to run home with terror of housekeepers who had been led astray by too much coffee and too much tattle, and one heard nothing more than this restless cry, pregnant with quarrels: "Good Lord! And my soup! And my soup, which isn't ready!" Section 9